I was really looking for books that were contemporary fiction because those images are so absent in the books that I'm seeing that are translated. So really being aware that often when those contemporary images are missing, kids get the sense of a culture only being set in the past and not also being part of the present. And there's also tends to be a high focus on rural and village life and very little books set in highly urban settings. And for many kids today, they live in urban settings. Now, another really big issue is finding books. So I've just talked about some of these authors and things for you to be aware of in terms of who's writing a book. But you also need to be able to find the books. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Worlds of Words, but I just found a brand new site. And the name of the site is Children's Books for Young Readers. Chinese Books for Young Readers. Because they wanted to use something that we posted on our website. And was really, it's a website, and while it says young readers, they're talking about books in Chinese for both children and teens. It's a whole site that's devoted to looking at what are the books that are available. It's a site that's in the US, but it's all books written in Chinese. And they're posting lots of different kinds of information about those books on that site. So I would really encourage you to go to that site. I haven't had a lot of time, but I've spent some time looking on the site and really found it useful. So one thing you can do is to go to different databases on web and blogs and websites. There are different kinds of award lists, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit more, and then there are digital books. So on our Worlds of Words site, and the site no longer looks like this, we just did a redo. For example, we have a journal called Wow Review that reviews books and looks at their authenticity. We also have a whole book search. Now the problem is our focus is books in English, reflecting global settings, so it may or may not be useful to you. But the blogs that we post pick up lots and lots of issues. So for example, the reason that the Chinese book site, the Chinese Books for Young Readers picked up our website was that you can free on their website, primarily traditional literature, but they're in all different languages, reflecting the diversity of your students, for example, if you wanted to find things in their own mother tongues, as well as in Chinese. Now, the second thing, the other thing I want to talk about is authenticity, accuracy, authenticity, and representation. So I'm really concerned when I pick up a book, how much it actually reflects the culture that it says it's reflecting. Does this book really reflect the beliefs, the values of a cultural group, and depict those details of everyday life and language? And in saying that, I also recognize that there's always diversity within any group. So there's never a single book. You always have to have multiple texts. There is not a Chinese culture. There's many different versions and forms of Chinese culture. And there's a range of ways that people act and think within sort of this big umbrella of Chinese culture. But what I know is that I want a book that's authentic, that when a child from that culture reads that book, they're affirmed and they say, this is who I am. I see myself in this book. And when a child who's from outside of that culture reads the book, they're able to identify with the book and find something of value for them in learning that. An example of finding yourself within a book, one of the people that I work with very closely is Pakistani. Her name is Simi Aziz. And Simi talks about that the majority of books that she sees that depict places like Pakistan and Afghanistan shows Muslim characters, but secular, doesn't show them deeply engaged with their own religious beliefs. Because children's books are often stay away from religion, sort of that, don't touch that. But for her, she never sees herself in the book because many Muslims are very deeply religious and it touches every aspect of the life. So separating out being Muslim from being religious is something that she finds continuously those books for her don't ring true. And it would be okay if some were secular, but she wants some, she's also looking for herself in those books. So let me just very briefly talk about some problems, things to watch out for. One is details of everyday life, accuracy. So sometimes there's a problem in books with accuracy. So, for example, the Yoon and the Jade Bracelet, which is at the bottom, is a Korean-American book. It's a story about a Korean-American child. The problem with the book is that in the book, there's a tradition that the family participates in that has to do with the giving and wearing of a jade bracelet, and that tradition is Chinese, not Korean. So it was one where the author and illustrator got two Asian cultures confused, and that detail is inauthentic. Now, I use the book, and I just point, you know what, the author got this wrong. And actually, the kids learn more about the culture by pointing that out than if I didn't use the book, right? The Day of Ahmed's Secret, I was sharing that in Chen Chen's class the other day. That's a book set in Cairo, and it shows camels and donkeys on the main streets of Cairo. Not true. You get run over by buses and cars and trucks. So there are details that are wrong in the story, and we kind of say, well, those are just little details. They don't really matter. But when somebody gets a detail wrong that's from your life, it matters. So my cultural background, my family is actually 2 generations back with Amish. And so the raising of Yoder's Barn is a book set in Amish culture. And there's a very little detail in the book, which is they call the character Stolz Foot. And the name is supposed to be Stolz Fuß, not Foot. And it was really interesting to me as I read the book. That's a really tiny detail. I was so angry. And it was right away, okay, I'm suspicious of this author. So I think the details matter. Sometimes people say, you're just being too picky. The details don't matter. And my response is, yes, it does. If it's from your culture, it matters. You don't like to see somebody who got those details wrong, right? A second aspect is authenticity. And accuracy and authenticity to me are different things. Authenticity is the core values at the heart of the culture. It's the believability. It's that the characters act and think in ways that are viewed as possible by insiders. So, for example, and you may not agree with this, but 2 Chinese researchers in the U.S. Critiqued Ed Young's The Voice of the Great Bell because it is based on the whole the Chinese notion of honoring your parents and doing whatever you can to respect your parents. But in this particular book, a girl throws herself into molten metal in order for her father to cast a bell that's pure of sound. And their critique of that book is that while filial piety is a very much a Chinese culture, no Chinese parent expects their child to give up their life. That's too extreme, and that's not a true reflection of that there's an authenticity problem there. The books over to the right are all books that actually come out of Muslim culture, and one of the critiques that CD's made of those books is that all 3 books involve females and are all based on Western notions of feminism rather than Muslim notions of feminism. So really not understanding that within Muslim culture, feminism is a very strong value and it's there, but imposing a Western feminism on instead, and that's an authenticity issue. The book can be accurate and still have an authenticity problem. Oops. And the last one is representation. So the representation refers to, the issue is not the individual book, but how the book fits into the broader collection of books that are available. So, for example, there are times that a certain image gets so overrepresented that children think that's the way the world is. So, for example, in the U.S., we have so many books that are on the Cultural Revolution that I was working with a group of 5th grade kids, and they thought the time period of the Cultural Revolution is still how China is today. Because that was the only image they saw. Yu Young found that in books that portray Korean Americans in the U.S., 18 of 24 picture books that have been published, so she found 24 picture books that showed Korean American children, 18 of those showed Korean American children who had just arrived in the U.S. The problem with that is that it gives then children other children the perspective that most Korean Americans have just arrived on the plane. They're brand new immigrants. And that's not true. There are many generations. There are families of many generations that have been in the U.S. So the problem isn't the individual books, it's the collection of books. Does that make sense? So each individual book is accurate and authentic, but when you put so many books with the same representation in it, kids start to think that's the total picture. So, and another example, almost all of our books set in the Middle East show deserts and camels, and so that's what kids think the Middle East is. They don't have any other depiction of what that looks like. So it's the over-representation of just one image. This was a book that I shared the other day. This is an example of a book that is a problem because of its representation, not because of its authenticity and accuracy. This is a book published from Australia, and it's called Mirror. And when the book opens, one side of it is in Arabic, the other side is in English. And you open the book side by side, and they're wordless. And one shows, they both show a family going to market. The book set in Sydney, which is the one, the pages set in Sydney all show modern Sydney, urban life, going to the big, market, big store, big box store. The book on the right, the story on the right is set in very rural Morocco with sand and camels and a small market. So when you go through the book, what it looks like is that Morocco is set back in time, and Sydney is modern and urban, right? The problem, and that's a misrepresentation, because of course there are cities in Morocco, right? And if you think about Australia, if you go to the outback, it is all sand, right? There's a huge area. So it would have been fair to compare Sydney with Casablanca, or it would have been fair to compare the outback with rural Morocco. But by putting the urban city against rural Morocco, it was an unfair representation. The book is accurate, it's authentic, but it's not representational. And therefore, it creates misconceptions. For example, a fourth grade teacher was telling me in Australia that in Melbourne that she shared this book with kids, fourth graders, just to give you why that's kind of misrepresentation. She shared it with kids, and the response from children was, these were Australian children, Melbourne kids in Melbourne. Oh, we need to raise money for the poor kids in Morocco. Right? I mean, that's really problematic. So, what I would say to you is check the background of the author. Really look at how the author's experiences connect to the content of the book. And in most books, you can get that information right in the book. If not, you can go to every author now has a website. And you can get that information within 5 minutes to know who the author is and how they connect. So I've got 3 books at the top that are all stories about refugees. The one on the left, The Long Road, is written by Luis Garay, and it's based on his own experiences coming from Nicaragua to Canada as a refugee. The one in the middle, Ziva Came on a Boat, is written by an author from Australia who worked in refugee camps. And the one on the clear right, Gleam and Glow, is a story written by E. Bunting who researched it. So each of those authors have very different locations in terms of their experiences, and they connect to the book. And it's not that I'm going to reject the book, but I'm going to read it much more carefully knowing about the author. And as I said, and we always shared that with the children. Before we read a book aloud, we tell who the author is and how the author relates to the book. Not evaluating, just saying, I'm going to read a book, Ziva Came on a Boat, and this author is from Australia and worked in refugee camps, and then I read the story. And the group of kids that I've been working with in a school that I worked with for 4 years, the librarian told us that she started to read a book aloud, and the kids stopped her and said, "You have to know who the author is before you read the book." Because it changes how you read it and how much you trust and what that author is saying. The other thing that we really do is to really look, you really need to look for contemporary images. And make sure that you're looking for a range of representations and who tells the story. The last thing I want to talk about is, just very briefly, is that notion of using it with children. And just being very aware that you can use a book on Chinese culture, and it can be so far removed from the experiences of the child that you're reading it to in terms of their own culture, that instead of them coming to respect Chinese culture, they might view Chinese culture as weird or strange. And so really think about the books that you're using and how you're using them with children, how you frame that book. So you probably want to start with books that are going to be very closely connected in children's lives, where they can find something in the book, like, you know, their relationship with a dog or relationship with a parent, where they can make a strong connection and then move gradually into books that are less and less familiar. Because you don't want to establish Chinese culture as exotic or unusual. You want kids to see that culture is part of the way that we all live and think in the world. And that also means that you need to use books from the children's own cultures, right? Because in your school, without that, the children need to see themselves as having culture and value their cultures, as well as come to value Chinese culture. The one thing that I do, I just want to give you a couple of examples here at the end of ways. The other thing we really try to do with children's books, in using them with children, is to really engage them in dialogue, to get them talking and thinking with each other. And some of that for you would be authentic uses of Chinese language, knowing that they may have to move back and forth between Chinese and their own, and English or whatever their other language is, because they may not be able to express everything in Chinese, but having that chance to have conversations can really help them. So one of the strategies that we use in responding, and these are ways to respond to children's books. And the couple of examples that I'm going to show you right now, what I want to emphasize is that these ways of responding to books are based on children finding their own issues within the book, making that their discussion an inquiry. It's not asking them a set of questions about what we think they should have understood about the book. So what we're trying to do is use strategies that encourage the kids to revisit the book, to talk with each other about the book, but without us asking the questions. And so this is an example. For example, we use something called a graffiti board, where we'll put a large piece of white paper in the middle of the table, and as children are either reading the book or being read to, what they're doing is they're sketching down. They're each, like these boards each have 4 or 5 children sitting around them, and they're just quickly sketching down words or pictures to help them remember the story. Now, one of the things that's really nice about this particular strategy is it captures your in-process thinking, and it gives the kids a chance to process in their own, whatever language they're processing in their head, before they're expected to turn and talk with each other. So for example, in our case, not the ones I got here, but I'll often see children writing on the graffiti boards in Spanish, even though then when they turn to talk with each other, they then speak in English, because it gives them a chance to first think about those ideas in their own mother tongue. So graffiti boards, the kids like them because there aren't any rules. They can draw, they can write, and it's just to capture what's in their heads. This is an example with very young children where we had read aloud to them a book from Korean about a little boy and a girl on the subway, and these are kindergarten, only 5 years old. So they first listened to the story, and then the second time we read the story aloud, they were sitting all around the paper on the floor, sketching what was in their heads. And then we had a literature discussion. We also used a strategy called consensus board. And in consensus board, these are 5th graders, and they had finished reading a book. And then they each, around the sides, they each had a section, and they wrote or drew their response to the book. Then they turned and talked to each other and shared their responses. And then the last thing they did was they came to consensus on what they thought were still the big issues in the books that they needed to look at more closely. So the consensus part is the issues they wanted to discuss more the next day.